The American frontier in the early 1800s was a place where beauty and brutality existed in equal measure, where survival wasn't guaranteed, but earned through knowledge, luck, and sheer will. Hugh Glass was a frontiersman who'd spent years in this wilderness, a trapper, a hunter, a man who'd become part of the landscape itself. He understood nature's rhythms in ways civilized men never could. He read animal behavior like others read books. He interpreted weather signs that most people missed completely. He'd faced death repeatedly and survived through skill and experience. But nothing in his background could have prepared him for what was coming. If stories of men who refused to die despite impossible odds interest you, subscribe to Echoes Across the Frontier. Drop your location in the comments. We track where these accounts reach worldwide. Glass was on solo reconnaissance for a fur trapping expedition in the upper Missouri River region when he stumbled upon a grizzly bear with 2 cubs. The bear, protecting her young, charged without warning or hesitation. The attack was swift, brutal, devastating. The grizzly was a creature of immense power and ferocity that most humans couldn't comprehend. She tore into Glass with claws and teeth that ripped through flesh like paper. She broke his bones with casual violence. She ripped open his back, exposing muscle and bone. She slashed his throat, damaging his windpipe. He fought back with his knife, with his bare hands, with desperation, born of pure survival instinct. But it was hopeless. He was completely overmatched against 800 pounds of muscle and fury. His companions, hearing his screams, rushed to help. They managed to drive the bear away by shooting it. But the damage was catastrophic. Glass was still alive, but barely. His body was a mangled wreck. His wounds were horrific beyond anything they'd seen. His chances of survival were essentially zero. The expedition leader, seeing the gravity of Glass's injuries, made a difficult decision. They couldn't carry him with them. They were in hostile territory with winter approaching. They couldn't afford being slowed down by a dying man. He ordered 2 men to stay with Glass until he died, to give him proper burial, then to catch up with the main party. The 2 men chosen were John Fitzgerald, a hardened, cynical trapper driven by fear and greed, and Jim Bridger, a young, inexperienced 19-year-old who was too afraid to challenge Fitzgerald's authority. They made a promise to the leader, a promise to stay with Glass, to care for him, to honor him in death. Days passed. Winter grew colder. The threat of attack from the Arikara tribe loomed constantly, and Glass did not die. He lay there moaning, breathing, clinging to life with tenacity that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying to witness. Fitzgerald began to panic. He was driven by fear, by greed, by desperate desire to survive. He saw Glass not as a man, but as a burden, a liability, a threat to his own survival. He convinced Bridger that Glass was as good as dead, that they were wasting their time, that they were putting their own lives in danger by staying with him. And so they broke their promise. They took Glass's rifle, his knife, his fire-starting kit, everything he would need to survive. They left him to die alone and defenseless in the heart of wilderness. It was an act of betrayal as cold and brutal as winter itself. For Glass, this betrayal transformed his struggle for survival into something more. It was no longer just about staying alive. It was about revenge. It was about a debt that had to be paid. Left for dead with a broken leg, a ripped open back, and a slashed throat, Hugh Glass should have died. By all logic, by all reason, by all laws of nature, he should have succumbed to his wounds, to the cold, to the predators that roamed the wilderness. But Hugh Glass refused to die. Unable to walk, he began to crawl. He dragged his broken body across frozen ground, inch by painful inch. His world was reduced to the earth beneath his hands, the air in his lungs, the fire burning in his belly. It was a primal, elemental struggle, a battle between one man's will to live and the indifference of the universe. He ate whatever he could find. He dug for roots with his bare hands, fingernails tearing and bleeding. He chewed on berries and bark that tasted like dirt. He scavenged carcasses of dead animals, eating meat that was half rotted. He drank from frozen puddles and icy streams that burned his damaged throat. He was no longer a man, but a creature, driven by a single, all-consuming instinct to survive. As temperatures plummeted to 30, 40 degrees below zero, he made a series of brutal, brilliant decisions that kept him alive. He slept inside the carcass of a dead bison, using the animal's body heat to keep from freezing to death during the coldest nights. He cauterized his own wounds with gunpowder and fire, a desperate act of self-preservation that was as painful as it was necessary. He followed the rivers, knowing they would eventually lead him to civilization. Every day was a battle. Every day the wilderness tried to kill him, and every day he refused to die. He crawled, he limped, he stumbled, but he never stopped moving forward. He was fueled by a single burning desire to find the men who had left him for dead and to make them pay. After weeks of crawling, of dragging his broken body across frozen earth, Hugh Glass did the impossible. He stood up. He walked. It was a clumsy, stumbling gait, a parody of normal human movement. But it was a movement. He was no longer a creature of the dirt, but a man who could stand on his own 2 feet. He was a man returning from the dead. He began to hunt again, using his wilderness knowledge to trap small animals, to fish in frozen rivers, to find the food he needed to regain his strength gradually. He traveled hundreds of miles alone through a landscape that was as beautiful as it was hostile. He crossed mountains, he forded rivers, he navigated forests filled with enemies, both human and animal. As he traveled, rumors began to spread through the frontier. Trappers and traders, soldiers and settlers began hearing stories of a man who'd been mauled by a grizzly, left for dead, and had somehow survived. They heard stories of a man covered in scars, a man who was more ghost than human, a man walking across the wilderness driven by a single burning desire for revenge. Glass was no longer just a man. He was a legend, a myth, a revenant. He was a symbol of the indomitable human spirit, a testament to the power of one man's will to live. He was a presence as inevitable as the changing seasons, a force of nature that could not be stopped. Fitzgerald, safe in the comfort of a frontier fort, heard the rumors. He dismissed them as tall tales, as drunken ramblings of frontiersmen. But as the stories grew more detailed, more specific, more credible, a seed of fear began growing in his heart. He had left a man for dead, and that man was coming for him. Hugh Glass, the man who had been hunted by a grizzly, by the wilderness, by death itself, was now the hunter. He tracked Fitzgerald with single-minded determination, relentless focus that was as cold and sharp as winter wind. He was no longer just a man seeking revenge. He was an instrument of justice, a force of nature, a reckoning that was long overdue. He found Fitzgerald at a U.S. Army fort where the traitor had enlisted as a soldier, seeking protection of the uniform, safety of the law. Fitzgerald, a man who'd lived by the law of the wilderness, was now hiding behind the laws of civilization. It was a hypocrisy that Glass could not and would not tolerate. Glass did not act impulsively. He waited, he watched, he planned. He was a patient hunter, a man who knew the right moment would come. And when it did, he struck. The confrontation was not a duel of honor, not a civilized affair. It was a brutal, savage fight, a desperate struggle for survival between two men who understood violence intimately. They fought with ferocity born of hatred, of fear, of deep primal instinct to kill or be killed. Glass, despite his wounds, despite his exhaustion, was the stronger of the two. He overpowered Fitzgerald. He pinned him to the ground. He held a knife to his throat. He had him. He had the man who had left him for dead. The man who had stolen his rifle, his knife, his chance at a decent death. He had the man who had betrayed him. And then he stopped. In that moment, with Fitzgerald at his mercy, Hugh Glass made a choice that would define him more than his survival ever could. He could have killed him. He could have taken his revenge. The revenge that had fueled him for months. The revenge that had kept him alive when all hope was lost. But he didn't. He looked at Fitzgerald, at the fear in his eyes, at the pathetic, whimpering creature he had become. And he saw not a monster, but a man. A weak, cowardly, pathetic man, but a man nonetheless. And he realized that killing him would not bring him peace. It would not heal his wounds. It would not bring back the life he had lost. Instead, he did something else. He dragged Fitzgerald to the edge of a raging, icy river. He looked him in the eye and said words that would echo through frontier history. Revenge is in God's hands, not mine. And then he pushed him into the current. Fitzgerald was swept away, his body tossed and turned by powerful, unforgiving water. He was carried downstream toward the territory of the Arikara, the tribe he had feared, the tribe he had used as an excuse to abandon Glass. The Arikara warriors, seeing him in the river, did not hesitate. They killed him. They took their own revenge, their own justice. The frontier, the wilderness, the world that Fitzgerald had tried to escape, had finally caught up with him. Glass watched from a distance. He did not celebrate. He did not cheer. He did not feel a sense of triumph. He simply watched, a silent, solitary figure on the banks of the river. The debt had been paid, but it had not been paid by him. It had been paid by the frontier itself. Hugh Glass survived. He lived for another 10 years after his ordeal. A man who was a legend in his own time. A man who had been to hell and back. A man who had faced death and had emerged alive. But he was not a man who had found peace. His body was a roadmap of his ordeal, a collection of scars that told the story of his survival. His back was permanently disfigured from the bear attack. His throat bore marks that made his voice forever changed. His leg never healed properly, leaving him with a permanent limp. His soul was just as scarred, his faith in humanity shattered beyond repair. His ability to trust, to love, to connect with other people was gone forever. He had survived, but he had not won. He had taken his revenge, but it had not brought him solace. He was a man forever haunted by the memory of his ordeal, a man forever alone, a man forever a stranger in the world of men. His story is a brutal, unforgiving reminder of a simple truth, that survival is not victory. It is a reminder that there are some wounds that never heal, some scars that never fade, some experiences that change a man forever. It is a reminder that the wilderness, the frontier, the world that Hugh Glass inhabited, was a world that did not care about justice, about fairness, about the lives of men. It was a world that was as beautiful as it was brutal, as awe-inspiring as it was indifferent. Understanding the magnitude of Hugh Glass's survival requires understanding the creature that nearly killed him. The grizzly bear, also known as the North American brown bear, is one of the most powerful and dangerous predators on the continent. An adult male grizzly can weigh up to 800 pounds, stand over 7 feet tall on its hind legs, and run at speeds up to 35 miles per hour despite its massive size. Grizzlies are equipped with massive claws that can be up to 4 inches long, powerful jaws that can crush bone, and strength that is almost incomprehensible to humans who haven't witnessed it. They are territorial animals, fiercely protective of their young, and they will attack without hesitation if they feel threatened in any way. An attack by a grizzly bear is one of the most terrifying experiences a human being can endure. The sheer power, the speed, the ferocity of the animal is overwhelming to the senses. Most people who are attacked by a grizzly bear do not survive the encounter. Those who do survive are often left with horrific injuries that can take months, even years to heal if they heal at all. Hugh Glass was attacked by a female grizzly with 2 cubs, the most dangerous type of grizzly encounter possible. The bear was not hunting him for food. She was protecting her young, and she was relentless in her attack. The fact that Glass survived the initial attack was a miracle. The fact that he survived the aftermath, the months of crawling through the wilderness with his wounds, was something beyond a miracle. It was a testament to the power of the human will, to the refusal to accept death, to the determination to live no matter the cost. The landscape that Hugh Glass traveled through was one of the most remote, most inhospitable, most dangerous regions in North America. The Upper Missouri River region, in what is now Montana and South Dakota, was a vast wilderness of mountains, rivers, forests, and prairies. It was a land of extremes where the summers were hot and dry and the winters were brutally cold, in ways that could kill unprepared men in hours. In winter, temperatures could plummet to 40, 50, even 60 degrees below zero. The wind would howl across the plains, cutting through any clothing, freezing exposed skin in minutes. The snow would pile up in drifts that were taller than a man standing upright. The rivers would freeze solid, their surfaces covered with ice thick enough to support the weight of a bison. It was a landscape that was as beautiful as it was deadly. The mountains were majestic, their peaks covered with snow, their slopes covered with pine forests that seemed to stretch forever. The rivers were swift and clear, fed by mountain streams and melting snow. The prairies were vast and empty, stretching to the horizon in all directions with nothing to break the monotony. It was a land untouched by civilization, a land governed by the laws of nature, a land as indifferent to human life as the stars in the sky. For Hugh Glass, this landscape was both his enemy and his salvation. It was the wilderness that had nearly killed him through cold and starvation and predators. But it was also the wilderness that had kept him alive. He knew its rhythms, its secrets, its dangers better than most men. He knew where to find food when there seemed to be none. He knew where to find water when streams were frozen. He knew where to find shelter when exposure threatened death. He was a man who was as much a part of the landscape as the mountains and the rivers and the forests. And that knowledge, that deep, intuitive understanding of the natural world, gained through years of experience, was what allowed him to survive when any reasonable person would have died. The Arikara, also known as the Ree, were one of the most powerful and feared tribes of the Upper Missouri River region during the early 19th century. They were a semi-nomadic people, living in earth lodge villages along the river, practicing agriculture, and hunting bison across the vast prairies. They were skilled warriors known for their ferocity in battle, their skill with the bow and arrow, and their deep knowledge of the land that gave them tactical advantages. The Arikara had a complex relationship with the white trappers and traders who were beginning to move into their territory in increasing numbers. Sometimes they traded with them peacefully, exchanging furs for guns, ammunition, and other manufactured goods they couldn't produce themselves. But more often they were hostile, seeing the white men as invaders, as threats to their way of life, as enemies to be killed without mercy or hesitation. The threat of an Arikara attack was a constant presence in the minds of every trapper working the region. They traveled in groups for safety whenever possible. They posted guards at night who stayed awake in shifts. They avoided areas that were known to be Arikara territory unless absolutely necessary. An encounter with the Arikara could be deadly, a sudden, brutal attack that left no survivors and no witnesses to tell the tale. It was the fear of the Arikara that drove John Fitzgerald to abandon Hugh Glass in his moment of greatest need. He was terrified of being caught by the tribe, of being tortured using methods that were legendary for their cruelty, of being killed slowly and painfully. And so he left Glass to die, taking his rifle, his knife, his chance at survival. It was an act of cowardice disguised as pragmatism, an act of betrayal disguised as necessity, an act that would haunt Fitzgerald for the rest of his short life. And in the end, it was the Arikara who took their revenge in ways Fitzgerald had feared most. When Glass pushed Fitzgerald into the river, when the current carried him downstream into Arikara territory, the warriors were waiting on the banks. They killed him just as Fitzgerald had feared they would. The frontier, the wilderness, the world that he had tried to escape through his cowardice had finally caught up with him. Hugh Glass was a fur trapper, a man who made his living by hunting and trapping animals for their pelts in one of the most dangerous occupations on the frontier. The fur trade was one of the most important industries in early 19th century America, a business that was driven by the insatiable European demand for beaver pelts that commanded extraordinary prices in the markets of London and Paris. Beaver fur was used to make hats, coats, and other luxury items that were status symbols among the wealthy, and it commanded prices high enough that men were willing to risk their lives in the wilderness for the chance to make a fortune. The trappers, also known as mountain men, were a rough, hardy breed of individuals who were willing to risk everything in uncharted territories for the possibility of wealth. They traveled deep into the unmapped regions of the West, living off the land for months at a time, trading with native tribes when possible, and trapping beavers in the cold, swift rivers and streams. It was a brutal, dangerous business that killed men regularly. The trappers faced constant threats from hostile tribes who resented their presence, from wild animals that saw them as prey or competition, from the harsh, unforgiving climate that could kill in hours if you made mistakes. They lived in isolation that would drive most people insane, often going months without seeing another white man. They were men who were as wild and as untamed as the land itself. Men who were driven by desire for freedom, for adventure, for the chance to make their fortune outside the constraints of civilization. But the fur trade was also a business built on exploitation, on the systematic destruction of the natural world, on the displacement and destruction of the native peoples who had lived on the land for thousands of years. The trappers killed millions of beavers over the decades, driving the animal to the brink of extinction in many areas, and fundamentally altering entire ecosystems. They brought disease, violence, and alcohol to the native tribes, disrupting their way of life in ways that would prove irreversible, destroying their culture through contact. They were the vanguard of white civilization, the first wave of an invasion that would ultimately destroy the world they had come to exploit for profit. Hugh Glass was a part of this world, a man who made his living by killing animals, by taking from the land without regard for sustainability or consequences. But he was also a man who respected the wilderness in ways many trappers didn't, who understood its power, who lived by its rules rather than trying to impose his own. He was a man caught between two worlds, a man who was as much a part of the frontier as he was a part of the civilization that was systematically destroying it. What allowed Hugh Glass to survive when all logic, all reason, all the laws of nature said that he should die in the wilderness? What drove him to crawl across frozen ground for weeks, to drag his broken body through terrain that would have defeated healthy men? To refuse to give up even when death would have been a mercy that ended his suffering? The answer lies in the psychology of survival, in the deep primal instinct that drives human beings to cling to life no matter the cost or the suffering involved. Glass was a man driven by a single burning desire to live. He was a man who refused to accept death, who refused to give up, who refused to surrender to the indifference of the universe that didn't care whether he lived or died. But he was also driven by something else that was equally powerful: revenge. The betrayal by Fitzgerald and Bridger had transformed his struggle for survival into something more than just staying alive. It was no longer just about making it through another day. It was about finding the men who had left him for dead, about making them pay for their betrayal, about settling a debt that could only be paid in blood or justice. This desire for revenge gave him a purpose, a goal, a reason to keep going when all hope was lost and death seemed inevitable. It was the fire that burned in his belly, the fuel that kept him moving forward, the force that drove him through pain that would have broken other men. Without it, he might have given up during those first terrible weeks. He might have succumbed to his wounds, to the cold, to the overwhelming despair of his situation. But with it, he was unstoppable in ways that defied rational explanation. And yet in the end, the revenge did not bring him peace in any meaningful sense. When he finally confronted Fitzgerald after months of pursuit, when he had the man at his mercy with a knife at his throat, he realized that killing him would not heal his wounds, would not bring back what he had lost in the wilderness. He realized that revenge was a hollow thing, a thing that consumed but did not satisfy, that destroyed but did not rebuild. And so he let the frontier take its own revenge. He let the wilderness, the world that had nearly killed him, settle the debt in its own way. It is a profound, troubling insight into the nature of survival, into the cost of living when living requires becoming something less than fully human, into the burden of being human in a world that doesn't care about human concerns. Hugh Glass survived, but he did not win in any conventional sense. He lived, but he lost everything that made life worth living. He was a man forever haunted by his ordeal, forever scarred by his experience both physically and psychologically, forever alone in a world that no longer had a place for him. From a medical perspective, Hugh Glass's survival is almost incomprehensible even by modern standards. The injuries he sustained in the grizzly attack were catastrophic, injuries that would kill most people even with access to modern medical care and technology. His back was ripped open in multiple places, exposing muscle and bone to the elements and to infection. His throat was slashed deeply, damaging his windpipe and making breathing and swallowing difficult and painful. His leg was broken in multiple places, making walking impossible without healing that would take months under the best conditions. He had lost a massive amount of blood during the attack and was in severe shock afterward. In the early 19th century, there were no antibiotics to fight infection, No pain medications beyond alcohol. No surgical techniques that could have saved him from the worst of his injuries. The only treatment available was basic first aid at best, cleaning the wounds with whatever water was available, bandaging them with strips of cloth, and hoping desperately that infection did not set in. An infection was almost inevitable given the conditions. The wilderness was filled with bacteria, with dirt, with filth of every kind. The chances of Glass's wounds becoming infected were essentially 100% given the circumstances. And yet somehow, through some combination of luck, genetics, and sheer willpower that defies medical explanation, he survived. His body, through mechanisms that doctors even today don't fully understand, fought off the infection that should have killed him within days. His wounds, though they left him horribly scarred and disfigured for life, eventually healed enough that he could function. His broken leg, though it never healed properly and left him with a permanent limp, eventually allowed him to walk again after weeks of crawling. It was a medical miracle, a testament to the resilience of the human body, to its ability to heal itself under impossible conditions, to its refusal to die even when death seemed certain. But the physical scars were only part of the story of what Glass endured. He also suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, a psychological condition caused by exposure to extreme trauma that can be as debilitating as physical injuries. He was haunted by nightmares that woke him screaming, by flashbacks that made him relive the attack over and over, by a constant sense of fear and anxiety that never fully left him, even in supposedly safe situations. He was unable to trust other people after the betrayal, unable to form close relationships that required vulnerability, unable to find peace in human company. He was a man forever changed by his ordeal in ways that went far deeper than the physical scars on his body. A man forever scarred both physically and psychologically in ways that would never fully heal. The journey that Hugh Glass undertook from the site of the grizzly attack to Fort Kiowa was approximately 200 miles through some of the most challenging terrain imaginable. It was a journey that took him through some of the most remote, most dangerous, most inhospitable terrain in North America at a time when there were no maps, no trails, no support systems of any kind. And he made the journey alone, with no supplies, no weapons for most of it, no help from anyone, relying entirely on his own knowledge and determination. For the first 6 weeks, he crawled across frozen ground. He dragged his broken body across the landscape, inch by painful inch, using his arms to pull himself forward because his broken leg made walking impossible. He followed the Grand River, knowing from his years of experience that it would eventually lead him to the Missouri River, and from there to civilization and possible rescue. He traveled at night when the temperatures were coldest because he did not want to be seen by hostile tribes who might finish what the bear had started. He hid during the day, sleeping in whatever shelter he could find, conserving his strength for the next night's crawl across frozen ground. He ate whatever he could find that might be edible. He dug for roots with his bare hands, fingernails breaking and bleeding. He chewed on berries and bark that had little nutritional value but filled his stomach. He scavenged the carcasses of dead animals, eating meat that was half-rotted and swarming with maggots. He drank from frozen puddles and icy streams that burned his damaged throat with every swallow. He was no longer recognizable as a man in any conventional sense, but a creature of desperation, a thing that was driven by a single, all-consuming instinct to survive one more day and then another. After 6 weeks of this nightmare existence, he was able to stand for the first time. He was able to walk, though it was a clumsy, stumbling gait that covered ground slowly and painfully. He was able to hunt small animals using traps he fashioned from materials he found, to fish in the rivers using techniques he'd learned over years of frontier living, to find the food he needed to gradually regain his strength. He continued to follow the rivers, traveling downstream, always moving toward civilization with single-minded determination. He crossed mountains that would have challenged healthy men. He forded rivers that were numbingly cold. He navigated forests that were filled with enemies, both human and animal, who would have killed him if they'd caught him. He was attacked by wolves who saw him as easy prey. He was stalked by mountain lions who followed him for days. He was nearly killed by the cold on multiple occasions when temperatures dropped and he couldn't maintain adequate body heat. But he kept moving, always moving forward, driven by his desire for revenge that had become an obsession, by his refusal to die before settling accounts with the men who had betrayed him. And finally, after 3 months of hell that would have killed any normal person within days, after 200 miles of the most brutal travel imaginable, he reached Fort Kiowa. He walked into the fort looking like something that had crawled out of a grave, a skeletal, scarred, barely recognizable figure that shocked everyone who saw him. The men who saw him thought they were seeing a ghost or a hallucination. They had heard the rumors, the stories of the man who had been mauled by a grizzly and left for dead by his companions, but they had not believed them because they seemed too incredible to be true. And now here he was, standing before them covered in scars, a living testament to the power of the human will to survive against impossible odds. Jim Bridger was only 19 years old when he was ordered to stay with Hugh Glass until he died, and then bury him properly. He was a young, inexperienced trapper, just beginning his career on the frontier, a man who was still learning the ways of the wilderness and its unwritten rules. He was terrified of Fitzgerald, the older, more experienced man who had been assigned to stay with him, and who clearly had no intention of honoring their promise. And when Fitzgerald convinced him to abandon Glass and save themselves, he did not have the courage or the experience to refuse the older man's judgment. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his long life in ways that shaped his character. Bridger went on to become one of the most famous mountain men in American history, despite this early failure. A legendary scout, guide, and explorer whose name became synonymous with the frontier itself. He discovered the Great Salt Lake. He blazed trails through the Rocky Mountains that thousands would follow. He became a wealthy man through his knowledge and abilities. But he was never able to escape the guilt of what he had done to Hugh Glass that terrible winter. The memory of abandoning a dying man stayed with him through all his successes. When Glass finally caught up with him months after the attack, Bridger was terrified beyond reason. He thought Glass was going to kill him as revenge for the betrayal. He thought his life was over. But Glass, seeing the young man's genuine remorse, his obvious guilt, his sincere sorrow for what he had done, forgave him in a way he could never forgive Fitzgerald. He saw in Bridger a young man who had made a terrible mistake under pressure from someone older and more manipulative, a man who had been led astray by Fitzgerald's fear and greed, a man who deserved a second chance that Fitzgerald did not deserve. It was an act of mercy, an act of compassion, an act that spoke to Glass's fundamental character and humanity despite everything he'd endured. It demonstrated his ability to see beyond his own pain and suffering, to recognize genuine remorse when he saw it. Bridger never forgot this act of forgiveness. He carried the memory of Glass's mercy with him for the rest of his life, a reminder of the debt he owed to the man who had every reason to kill him, but chose not to. A reminder of the man who had given him a second chance when he deserved none. The story of Hugh Glass has become one of the most famous survival stories in American history and beyond. It has been told and retold in books, in movies, in legends that have been passed down from generation to generation for nearly 2 centuries. It is a story that speaks to something deep within the human soul that transcends culture and time. A story about the power of the human will, about the refusal to give up even when giving up seems rational, about the determination to survive no matter the cost to body or soul. But it is also a story about the cost of survival that is often overlooked in retellings, about the burden of living when living requires sacrificing your humanity, about the scars that never heal no matter how much time passes. Hugh Glass survived his ordeal in the wilderness, but he was forever changed by what he experienced. He was a man haunted by his experience for the rest of his life, a man unable to find peace in civilization or wilderness, a man forever alone even when surrounded by others. His story is a reminder that survival is not always a victory worth celebrating, that living is not always a blessing when life has been stripped of everything that makes it meaningful, that there are some experiences that change a person forever in ways that can never be undone. It is a reminder of the brutal, unforgiving nature of the American frontier during the era of westward expansion, of the world that Hugh Glass inhabited, of the price that was paid by the men and women who ventured into the wilderness seeking fortune or freedom. And yet it is also a story of hope in its own way, of resilience in the face of impossible odds, of the indomitable human spirit that refuses to surrender even when surrender seems like the only rational choice. Hugh Glass refused to die when death would have been easier. He crawled across 200 miles of frozen wilderness when any sane person would have given up. He survived injuries that should have killed him within hours. He found the men who had betrayed him and chose mercy over vengeance. He was a man who was as tough and as resilient as the land itself, a man who was a living testament to the power of the human will to survive against all odds. His story lives on nearly 2 centuries later, a legend of the American frontier, a reminder of a time when the world was a different place, wilder and more dangerous, a time when a man could be tested to the absolute limits of human endurance, a time when survival was not guaranteed, but earned through knowledge, luck, and will. It is a story that will be told for as long as there are people who long for adventure, who crave understanding of human limits, who seek to comprehend what humans are capable of when pushed beyond all reasonable boundaries. It is the story of Hugh Glass, the man who refused to die, the revenant who crawled back from the edge of death itself, the legend who proved that sometimes, against all logic and reason, the human will to survive can overcome anything.